President Trump there brushing off any concern over the shortage of diplomats in Rex Tillerson's State Department ahead of this critical five-country swing through Asia, with the North Korean threat looming over allies in that region. Joining me now is Anja Manuel, a former State Department official focused on Asia in Condoleezza Rice's State Department, and MSNBC political analyst. Rick Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy in John Kerry's State Department. Anja, we'll start with you if I can. The president has made relationships with China's president, South Korea's president, a priority, as he suggested during his first year. What do you think he fundamentally needs to accomplish on this trip? If you give us the simple checklist, what does he need to do well?
Thanks for having me. This trip is all about getting a unified approach to North Korea. I think that will be the focus. And frankly, there's been some positive movement in that direction. With all the tweets that I believe have been harmful, there is a very slim silver lining here, and that is that China and the U.S. have the closest behind-the-scenes talks they've ever had, the most detailed on North Korea. The other issue, of course, will be trade. I think you'll hear some tough talk. I've heard that behind the scenes, the U.S. administration hasn't quite decided what exactly they want to press China on trade, but I'm sure you'll hear a lot about it.
Rick, let me ask you a similar question, but, words do matter, and as Anja just suggested, maybe there's a small silver lining for some of the president's tweets, but those tweets have been potentially harmful, if not threatening, to our own national security about North Korea. What are the countries they're going to be watching for as they hear from the president, not just in Twitter, but in person?
Peter, you have to pack a lot of shirts. I'm just warning you. You know that. So the thing is, what they're going to be looking at is, what does America first mean in the context of the post-war order in Asia, where the U.S. was the foundation of stability? We have troops all over the place. People are going to be looking at Trump and seeing, is this guy really an autocrat? I mean, the clip that you just played where only I decide and only I matter, that's going to be very familiar to people like Xi Jinping. And by the way, the other thing I'd say to President Trump is, there's no such thing as a charm offensive with Xi Jinping. He has no personal feelings. He has interests the way leaders of countries do, and don't feel like you're persuading him of something that he doesn't want. Doesn't happen. So, but I think the president is in denial about that and doesn't realize it.
And so, Rick, broadly speaking, how, I want to ask you about Secretary Tillerson, of course, who has been leading the diplomatic effort in so much as one exists right now behind the scenes with North Korea, about the role that he'll be playing there, and how is he perceived by these foreign leaders, and how does that relationship between the president and his Secretary of State sort of make this trip any more challenging?
Well, it's always a difficult relationship throughout American history since, Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. But in some ways, Tillerson plays the role of a Trump translator. I mean, people realize they can do business with him, that he understands the international order. He's not going to put in minefields like Chuck was talking about. So I hope people look at him as a kind of a contrast to Trump. I mean, the inside guy and the outside guy. So Tillerson could keep everything under control, I hope.
Anja, a similar question to you, which is, Rex Tillerson, what do you make of this relationship between the Secretary of State, who's done much of the outreach in advance of the president, while the president's done a lot of it remotely, by Twitter, as it were, the Secretary of State now traveling alongside the president as they go to meet these countries. The Secretary of State basically told by his own boss, stop wasting your time when it comes to direct contacts with the North Koreans, or diplomacy.
It is certainly unhelpful that the president is undermining his own Secretary of State publicly. I think Secretary Tillerson should be commended for the hard work, behind-the-scenes work that he has done, bringing allies on board to confront the threat of North Korea. That is really important. It's unglamorous work. It requires a lot of calls to individual leaders and continually grooming those relationships. I think it's good that they're on this trip together, and I hope the president supports his Secretary of State.
Just a couple days ago, Anja, we heard from an administration official as I was in the briefing room preparing us for this trip, speaking of the relationship between President Trump and Rodrigo Duterte, of course, the controversial leader in the Philippines. This administration official saying the two men have a warm rapport. How would a Bush administration, how would Condoleezza Rice have viewed any administration official referring to a person responsible for all the attacks on his own people that Duterte is, describing a warm rapport between the two?
Well, I can't speak for Condi, but I know that you have to deal with leaders around the world that are do some unsavory things, including human rights abuses. I certainly wouldn't have described it as a warm rapport. The Philippines issue is a little more complex, though. Duterte, as you know, has turned very much towards China, but the United States is incredibly popular in the Philippines. We have a 90% approval rating here. So Duterte's own people don't want to have a negative relationship with the U.S. And by the way, our special forces have been helping Duterte kick ISIS out of one of his own cities. So I think you need to have a reasonable relationship, and I would hope that the U.S. administration, when they're there, can also say something about the human rights abuses in the Philippines, which are serious.
Rick, should the president be taking this meeting in the Philippines?
Well, I have to say, Anja talks very eloquently about the complexity of the situation in the Philippines. But the thing that stood out for me, that we have we always had a values-based foreign policy. And the President of the United States would stand up to dictators and autocrats, and they would be able to speak in two ways, talk about human rights and also talk about support. The Philippines is one of our oldest and best allies. You have to be able to do both. And now what happens with autocrats around the world is they look at Donald Trump and they see a model. They don't see someone who's chastising them. And I think that's a real sad thing for American foreign policy.
Rick Stengel, thank you very much. Anja Manuel, thank you very much as well. We appreciate your time, both of you.